The Basics of Rationalism. History of Psychology, Psych 182, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno, Professor Michael Botwin. In this unit, we're going to look at rationalism. And rationalism is a movement that was running counter to empiricism during the end of the Enlightenment years. Now, empiricists primarily are English, British Empire type folks. Rationalist, generally European, especially German. We'll see how this plays out in the next couple of units when we formally get into the founding of psychology, with Wundt having his basis in rationalism and his student Titchener having his foundations in empiricism, as he was an Englishman. So let's look at generally what's going on with rationalism. Now, the rationalists posit an active mind, and that active mind gives meaning to information interpreted from the senses. In other words, we're going again in our perennial battle in this class from what is of more value, the external stimuli versus the internal one. But the rationalists go on and say that the mind adds to the sensory information, and it does it by looking at truths and by processing information that cannot be experienced, but can be deduced through logic and reason. So let's look at some assumptions of the rationalist movement. First of all, they believed in the analysis of the content of innate thoughts. So they were looking at things like mental structures, principles, operations, and abilities that individuals have. They, like many other philosophers, were looking for the truth. And they thought the truth can't just come from experiencing something in the mind. To get at truth, you have to process that information. And you do that through logical deduction, argumentation, and analysis. As one of my favorite rationalists will say, sensory information must be digested. It's not enough to have the sensation of taste, you have to digest that information. So you need to know what that sensory information is, and in turn, how is that processed? Well, I always find it a useful intellectual tool to compare and contrast things. So let's compare and contrast empiricism and rationalism. Empiricism, the mind passively organizes information, and a person's thoughts are dependent upon their experiences, their association, and their hedonism or level of happiness. This gets at pleasure and pain. Counter that with the rationalists, and these aren't quid pro quo across these two columns. The rationalists say there's an active mind. The mind adds to the sensory information. And as we've already talked about, there's the assumption that there are innate, in other words, mental structures that are there pretty much from birth, that govern things like principles of thinking, operations, and abilities that we either have or have not. Furthermore, the empiricists say that morality is based on your external experiences. Whatever you've learned through your senses, you build your morality on. The rationalists believe truth is discovered by processing the sensory data. The empiricists have an extremely mechanistic view of behavior, and they're really not interested in the reasons for it like the rationalists are. And you see a fundamental difference in how they use logic. The empiricists are inductive, and the rationalists use deductive methods. This is going to lead to some interesting differences between these two groups as we go on and look at the major figures from each perspective. So hang on for that ride. We'll see you next time in the history of psychology. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.